biggest complaint that the JJK fandom had after the conclusion of JJK's manga was that there was a ton of unresolved plot lines left hanging. In fact, this complaint was so prominent that I actually, about 6 months ago, made a video talking about every single unresolved plotline left at the end of JJK's manga. However, because either Gege Akutami watches my videos even though he doesn't speak English, or because there's some cosmic entity out there punishing me for the sins of a previous life, pretty much immediately after I posted that video talking about every unresolved plotline in JJK, Modulo JJK's sequel dropped and proceeded to basically tie up every single unresolved plotline left at the end of JJK. Pretty much everything that JJK fans complained about at the end of JJK's manga is addressed over the course of Modulo. Now, as to whether or not fans appreciated how these hanging plot threads were dealt with, well, that's up to them. But now that the 25-chapter miniseries is completed, it's really hard to find things in JJK that don't have answers. Well, not that hard. There is still plenty of things that don't have answers, but there's certainly less now. And thus today, I wanted to go over every single unresolved plot line that Modulo tied up and how it did it, to either convince you to read Modulo, even though this video is going to be wrought with spoilers for it, or to possibly help you better understand just how important and well-written Modulo was. Because now that we've reached the end of Modulo, there are definitely people out there with torches and pitchforks, and I don't really think there should be. Well, yes, I was one of the people out there with a rare torch-pitchfork combo. I'm trademarking it. It's called the Porch. When JJK ended, the reason I had my porch out was because there was so many unresolved plot lines. And therefore, you can imagine that Modulo was kind of the perfect story for me. So today, let's try and make it the perfect story for you. Because today, we're talking every way that Modulo Fixed JJK Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for an additional Nick video every single week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're halfway through Neji versus Naruto. But before we get into that, I want to talk to you about the sponsor of today's episode, BetterHelp. Ever since I moved to LA, I've struggled with being my authentic self around a lot of my friends. See, because when a lot of your friends are, well, there's no good way to phrase this, famous, unfortunately, sometimes you can feel as though you shouldn't let out the real you because everyone else is so cool. But with the help of BetterHelp, I've actually become much better at letting myself be exactly who I want to be. I've allowed myself to make silly jokes. I've allowed myself to talk to people for hours about anime. And not only have I gotten closer to my friends because of it, but also I've stressed way less about my social interactions. And without BetterHelp, honestly, I don't know if it would have been possible. See, BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. All I had to do was take a quiz, and I got matched with a licensed therapist quickly. However, because I'm busy, sometimes we had to be flexible in how we communicated. So sometimes we did video calls, other times we did phone calls, and sometimes we would just text. And that flexibility and access to my therapist was key. However, if hypothetically the therapist that I was connected with wasn't the right fit, not only does BetterHelp make swapping therapists easy, but also completely free. So what are you waiting for? Over 6 million people have already started their better health journey with BetterHelp. And clearly it's working because BetterHelp's app sits at a 4.8 out of 5 stars on the App Store. So click the link in my description or go to betterhelp.com/weebcommander, 10% off your first month of therapy with BetterHelp. It's time we reflect, grow, and create positive change in our lives with BetterHelp. So there's really no good way to tackle all the plot threads that were left in JJK outside of maybe talking about them chronologically, but that's an insane amount of work for really no payoff. So we're just gonna work our way from plot threads that were left at the end of JJK that have solid answers that are presented in Modulo, all the way up to plot threads in JJK that were never addressed in Modulo. And there's not really a whole lot of gray area. Either things were addressed or they weren't, but we'll still work our way up. And thus, one of the first plot threads that we need to talk about that was left relatively open-ended at the end of JJK is what happened with the new Shadow Style School. See, some would say that we got an answer about what the future of the new Shadow Style School looked like before the end of JJK, as we actually spent a baffling amount of time in the last couple of chapters of JJK focusing on the new Shadow Style School, a plot line that many readers who knew that JJK was coming to an end deemed deeply unimportant. However, even though it did seem deeply unimportant, we got to see not only Mei hunt down the leader of the new Shadow Style school who was siphoning off age from all of the recruits of her school and kill her and make Kusakabe the next head of the new Shadow Style school, and Kusakabe, who was the new leader of the new Shadow Style school, got rid of all of their archaic methods. That is to say, he didn't monopolize the knowledge of things like simple domain, he didn't siphon off life force from all of the members of the new Shadow Style school, and more than anything, entering into the new Shadow Style school didn't require signing your life away. And while for most people that was probably enough information about the new Shadow Style school, you know, the creators of the simple domain, but we did get some new additional pieces of information about the new Shadow Style school in Modulo. For example, we learned that Wee is now in charge, and also Wee dresses up as Mei, which is not the weirdest thing those two have done with each other. We also know that either Kusakabe or Wee opened up the new Shadow Style school techniques to everyone, as Tsurugi uses a technique in his battle against Maru called Maculation that requires for him to open an augmented simple domain. And this technique allows for Tsurugi to launch an automatic counterattack against anybody who enters into a simple domain, kind of like how Miwa used it. On top of this, we see in the final chapter of Modulo that Wee was actually responsible for ensuring that the Japanese populace was accepting to the Sumerians by recording Dabura's battle against Maharaga and painting Dabura as the hero who saved Japan from the demon of 69 years ago in Maharaga. So while none of those are crazy updates that any of you were itching to hear about, they are still important updates about what's going on with the new Shadow Style school. But speaking of the events of 69 years ago, one of the plot threads that was left open at the end of JJK that fans were the most mad about was why Kenjaku flew off to America to introduce cursed energy to the president and what plot repercussions would come along with sorcerers who were abducted from the Culling Games and brought back to America. See, because while this plotline is at least referenced at the end of JJK, as Maki tells two reincarnated sorcerers who are still hanging out in Japan that because they're good guys and just want to fight against high-level opponents, that they can go fight against all the cursed spirits that they want to so long as they stay in Tokyo. And while telling these two that they can fight against all the cursed spirits they could possibly muster inside of Tokyo, she also tells them that a team of Japanese sorcerers is going to be sent to America to try to recapture the stolen Japanese sorcerers from the Culling Games. And while we never hear any report as to how this rescue mission for these Japanese sorcerers went, and we never really got an update on how the political situation changed between Japan and America after America openly kidnapped Japanese citizens, we do know what the repercussions of Kenjaku going to another country and introducing the concept of cursed energy were. And those were that Japanese people became incredibly valuable on the black market. See, because the second that it was identified that Japanese people passively emitted a new form of energy, individuals, companies, and entire nations became heavily interested in the idea of exploiting this natural energy emitted from Japanese people for some kind of alternative energy source. Therefore, there is an incredibly pertinent and powerful underground in Japan that focuses entirely on kidnapping either children or adults and selling them overseas. And therefore, it's an ongoing political crisis in Japan, and the vast majority of sorcerer duties in 2086 are cutting down on these underground people trading markets. However, fortunately for the citizens of Japan, the world is struggling in its endeavor to turn cursed energy into an alternative fuel, and thus the market for Japanese people is actually kind of taking a nosedive. As well, yes, they're able to emit cursed energy, the world can't figure out how to turn that cursed energy into, well, regular energy. And therefore, in actuality, Kenjaku's plan to bring the Americans over to the Culling Games to force them to enter into the barriers to try and kidnap sorcerers, thus registering them as sorcerers and therefore adding to the amount of cursed energy being dumped into all the barriers, was not only genius in the fact that it did work, but also genius in the fact that it had minimal-ish repercussions. Like, yeah, Japanese people got trafficked by the rest of the world for like 70 years, but Japan fought against that and was able to mitigate a fair amount of it, and by 2086, the market was basically dead on account of the fact that the world couldn't figure out how to use cursed energy. I mean, none of it's good, but it's not as bad as it could have been. But to talk about the failed plans of Kenjaku, another one of the largest plot threads that was left hanging at the end of JJK was what happened to the three great families. See, because at the end of JJK, all three of the three great families of Jujutsu were kind of decimated. Maki kills all of the combatants of the Zenin clan, and while she leaves all of the non-combatants, and therefore there is still technically a Zenin clan, all of the actual sorcerers are killed. And that doesn't mean that there can never be sorcerers again in the Zenin clan, but it means that the Zenin clan, effectively after Maki cut down all of their sorcerers, just became a clan of civilians. On top of this, a vast majority of the Kamo clan, at least the leading class of the Kamo clan, was killed by Kenjaku, who took over the Kamo clan in the lead up to the Shinjuku Showdown, and ousted the person who was supposed to be the next head of the Kamo clan, Noritoshi Kamo, making Kenjaku the head of one of the great families. However, as to how great that great family was after he killed what was undoubtedly a large section of their fighting force, we can't really say. And then there's the Gojo clan, which obviously lost its head when Gojo lost his legs. And as apparently the birth of Six Eyes users is tied through the fate of Jujutsu to the birth of a star plasma vessel, and whenever Tengen needs to re-merge with said star plasma vessel, there's a fair to decent chance that another Six Eyes user is never born. As not only is Tengen never gonna merge with another star plasma vessel, but Tengen's dead, and therefore if there will never be another star plasma vessel in Tengen merger, and therefore another star plasma vessel, there may never be another Six Eyes user, and thus with the Gojo clan would still have their inherited technique of the limitless. They'd have no control over it. However, it was confirmed in the final chapter of Modulo that all three great families still exist, as Yuji, while talking to Nobara about how to usher in a new generation of sorcerers who are going to fight against the handful of cursed spirits that still manifest every year, said that in order to gather and control as many cursed objects as possible to arm the heavenly restriction users who are going to have to fight against these cursed spirits for centuries to come, that they should ask the three great families to help them out, which implies that the three great families, that being the Kamo, the Zenin, and the Gojo, all still exist. But how? Well, yes, we understand that the majority of the Kamo clan's most powerful fighters were wiped out by Kenjaku when he put himself in charge of the clan. Noritoshi Kamo, rather than being killed by Kenjaku, was simply ousted. And because Noritoshi Kamo's mother had already been thrown out of the Kamo clan, rather than electing to fight and die in Shinjuku against Sukuna, he told everybody, hey, you guys have a great time doing whatever it is you want to do. I'm gonna leave Japan and go live with my family. And we see in chapter 271 that Noritoshi Kamo is seemingly very happy with his family somewhere. We don't know if it's overseas or in Japan. However, considering the fact that Kenjaku is killed during the Shinjuku Showdown, Noritoshi Kamo would be the logical person to be elected as the next head of the Kamo clan. And therefore, he probably was, and he probably used his power as the clan head to change how the Kamo clan treated people like his mother. He is, after all, the son of the 24th head of the Kamo clan, so it was his title to have. But even if it wasn't Noritoshi Kamo who took over the Kamo clan after Kenjaku's death, the Kamo clan still exists. And we could say the same for the Zenin clan. See, like we already said, Maki didn't kill the non-combatants, which means that more sorcerers could be born into the Zenin clan over the course of the last 70 years, and they probably have been. And while Maki follows in the footsteps of Toji and steps out of the Zenin clan, marrying into the Gojo clan, it's established that after the death of Naobito and Naoya, that Megumi takes over as the Zenin clan head. I mean, technically he takes over after Naobito's death because Naoya is never the clan head, but you get it. So there's a fair or decent chance that after the decimation of the Zenin clan, Megumi stepped in as the head of the Zenin clan. A role that he probably wouldn't want, but a role that he and he alone was qualified for. And well, yes, Maki was technically the only combatant left with the Zenin last name. Maki married Yuta. And we learned technically by the additional material given to us in the final volume of JJK, but also through Modulo, that Maki and Yuta took over the Gojo clan after Gojo's death, because of the Fujiwara-Tsuchiwara connection between the Gojo clan and the Okotsu clan. But because of this, both Heavenly Restriction and the 10 Shadows technique are now in the Gojo clan, as Tsurugi is a Heavenly Restriction user and Yuka is a 10 Shadows user. So what does the Zenin clan have going for it now? Apparently nothing. But since we're talking about things that were left in shambles at the end of JJK, another one of the biggest questions that was simply left unanswered at the end of JJK was, hey, what's gonna happen to all of the barriers around Japan now that Tengen's a smoldering rock? See, Tengen, as we learned, was responsible for not only the creation, but also the maintenance of several important barriers across Japan. Whether it was the barrier around Jujutsu Highs that made them impossible to find by non-sorcerers, the barrier around the Emperor's Palace that kept the Emperor safe from cursed spirits, or the multitude of barriers scattered across Japan that not only limited the amount of cursed spirits born, but also the power of barrier techniques of sorcerers using them within the confines of said barriers, and many other things. And on top of all of this, Tengen was also responsible for the maintenance of of the Star Room and the storehouses of the Jujutsu high schools, where several very important cursed objects were kept that the Jujutsu Society didn't want anybody else getting their mitts on. Now, those barriers were addressed at the end of JJK, as Gakuganji said by placing Sukuna's remains in the Star Room, the barriers should be held up for a little while longer. However, there was really no reason to worry, as all of those who were going to take over for the aging members of the Jujutsu Society had time to figure out how to fix these barriers. That's kind of all we got at the end of JJK, just like, you'll figure it out. However, in Modulo, it was established that these barriers are no longer necessary. Well, yes, some of the barriers, like the barriers around Jujutsu high schools, and especially the barrier around the Emperor's Palace, were still necessary. The vast majority of barriers that Tengen placed all across Japan were kind of useless now, because when Japan went public with the statement that cursed energy and cursed spirits are real, but they only exist in Tokyo, Japan kind of bought into that idea, and thus, from pretty much that moment on, cursed spirits only manifested in Tokyo. And therefore, in actuality, the only barrier that was really still needed was a barrier around Tokyo in order to keep the cursed spirits in. So the Jujutsu Society used the barrier that was around the Emperor's Castle, which is in the center of Tokyo, Ginza to be exact, and expanded that barrier out around the entirety of Tokyo. But because the barrier was so large, it's not that the barrier necessarily stopped cursed spirits from getting out, but rather it simply encouraged cursed spirits to stay in. However, because cursed spirits can and still sometimes do manifest outside of Tokyo, it's shown to us in chapter 12 that rather than traditional barriers, at least in the sense that Tengen controlled, warding barriers have been set up all around the country. Cursed objects covered with warding seals, placed either in high locations, low locations, or spiritual locations to ward away either already existing cursed spirits or the birth of additional cursed spirits. However, these warding barriers need to be maintained by sorcerers like Yuka, Saruki, and Maru. And now that all the 50,000 or so Sumerians, who are all cursed energy sensitive, have been integrated into the Japanese population, they can also help Japan with the maintenance of these warding sites. But since we're talking about wide-sweeping political decisions that need to be made in order for the Sorcerer Society to continue functioning, another one of the hanging plot threads that was left at the end of JJK was a question of what's going to happen now that Gojo has created a power vacuum at the top of the Jujutsu Society by killing all of the Jujutsu higher-ups. Because if you remember, after Gojo was unsealed from the prison realm, upon hearing that after he was sealed, the Jujutsu higher-ups not only sentenced Principal Yaga, but also Yuji to death, Gojo decided to sentence all of them to death. This means that after the Shinjuku Showdown, Gakuganji becomes the de facto leader of the Jujutsu Society, as he is the highest ranked non-great family associated person in Japan, because Gojo and Yaga and a lot of other important people died. But in Modulo, it appears as though some kind of actual government has replaced the Jujutsu higher-ups, and rather now the entity that rules the sorcerer world is a council of sorcerers that is seemingly led by a character known as Miyaguni. And this council seemingly deals with everything in the Jujutsu Society, whether it be the great exorcisms that happen once a month to cull the low-ranking cursed spirits inside of Tokyo. They deal with the political situation and political relationship with entities that are cursed energy sensitive, like the Sumerians, and they apparently control the barrier around Tokyo, as they were able to in the lead up to the battle between Dabura and Yuka augment that barrier to try and funnel all of the cursed spirits into the Tokyo Bay. And while as a governmental body, they definitely don't get everything right, they're a lot better than the previous governmental body. So, progress, something this country hasn't experienced in years. But speaking of things that have the potential to be better than they are, there's a lot of people who at the end of JJK were upset with how one character was treated, and that one character was Potential Man himself, Megumi. Now, the reason that a lot of people were upset with how Megumi was treated at the end of JJK is because even though Megumi was able to break out of the control of Sukuna and destroy him as a vessel, we never really heard a lot about what happened with Megumi towards the end of JJK. Yes, obviously, Megumi had like the worst couple of weeks of all time. He gets taken over by Sukuna. The first thing that Sukuna does is kill his sister, and then while Megumi is still being controlled by Sukuna, cuts down basically his father in Gojo, all the while bearing the burden of adaptation of being hit by infinite void a couple of times. And not until Yuji is able to weaken Sukuna's control over Megumi to such a degree is Yuji able to reach out to Megumi and snap him out of his depression, causing for Sukuna to die. But after that happens, what happens to the guy who's now the head of the Zenin clan and the only surviving 10 Shadows user, who also was the host of Sukuna for a long enough amount of time that he might have, like Yuji, picked up a thing or two from Sukuna, like, a dismantle. Well, at the end of JJK, we weren't told. See, while additional time in the final volume was given to both Nobara and Yuji, out of Gojo's 3 students, the only one who didn't get additional time was Megumi. So questions like, did Megumi ever master his domain, or did he ever conquer the 10 shadows, or did he marry Hana? Well, they never got answers. Yes, it's heavily implied that Hana and Megumi end up together, and people theorize that Miyaguni is a descendant of Megumi, but we don't know if he became the head of the Zenin clan, or followed in the footsteps of his father and married into his wife's family. And Modulo didn't provide any answers. See, it's in this part of the video that we're starting to get to the things that Modulo did not answer. Megumi is mentioned a grand total of once in Modulo, and that is in the last chapter when Nobara and Yuji are trying to figure out how to turn Yuji into a cursed object when he dies. And while laughing about how ridiculous the situation is, Nobara says, I wish Megumi was here, implying that Megumi is probably dead, which we kind of knew already the second that Yuka got revealed as a 10 Shadows user, because so far as we know, there can't be 2 10 Shadows users living simultaneously. And thus Megumi is not only dead, but he's been dead for like 16 years at least. So did Megumi master the 10 Shadows? Did he master his domain? Did he take over the Zenin clan? But what we can say is that he had the potential to do all those things. And sometimes, isn't that all that matters? But since we're talking about things that don't get answers in Modulo, another thing that people were very curious about at the end of JJK was what's exactly happening with Yuji's domain expansion. See, Yuji's domain expansion, which never gets a name and never really gets any set of abilities, is displayed at the very end of his final battle with Sukuna. And in this domain, which is seemingly the largest domain expansion we've ever seen, Yuji essentially manifests the entirety of his hometown. However, that seems to be about all it does. Well, it's not all it does, because Yuji's domain expansion, like all other domain expansions, gives Yuji a sure hit effect. And therefore, any and all attacks that Yuji landed on Sukuna while in this domain expansion attacked specifically the barrier between Sukuna and Megumi's souls. But as to what technique was imprinted on the barrier, what the name of the domain expansion is, or really any other details about this domain expansion, we don't know. And unfortunately, after the conclusion of Modulo, we still don't know. However, people believe the second that we saw Yuji in Modulo that we would finally get to see his domain expansion at the peak of its power, because he's, after all, had 70 years to master it, and therefore he almost definitely has. However, unfortunately, over the course of those 70 years, Yuji has gotten so ludicrously powerful that there's nobody in the Modulo timeline who would warrant him using his domain expansion. In fact, there's hardly anybody in the Modulo timeline who warrants Yuji taking his hands out of his pockets. And therefore, while we definitely got an idea of how powerful Yuji has gotten over the course of the last 70 or so years, we don't know what the peak of his power looks like. We saw him use a very nonchalant convergence and a very nonchalant dismantle, both of which were absolutely the highest level application of either of those techniques we have ever seen, and therefore it stands to reason that if we saw him use a domain expansion, the same would probably be true for that as well. But unfortunately, no questions were answered. Oh, I completely forgot. There was another question that people very much wanted an answer to at the end of JJK that we never did, that we did get an answer to in Modulo. In fact, this is probably the thing that most people were upset about at the end of JJK. See, because one of the largest talking points in JJK, especially as it pertains to Gojo and Geto's backstories, is that the role of a sorcerer is to fight and die in order to protect non-sorcerers. And while this wouldn't be especially bad if non-sorcerers knew that they were being protected, on account of the fact that up until the end of JJK, cursed energy and cursed spirits were kept a secret from the Japanese society, sorcerers' lives, fights, and deaths were complete unknowns to those they were protecting. And therefore the people of Japan lived in perfect bliss, not knowing about cursed spirits. Well, usually teenagers fought to their death to protect them. And therefore, sometimes when humanity had to come face to face with cursed spirits or cursed users, they treated them as devils, demons, and those who channeled these powers as witches, which is what eventually led to Geto breaking, as he saw a village turning against 2 children who were cursed technique users, blaming them for the cursed spirits that had been terrorizing them for years. And thus it felt as though, as we were building towards the end of JJK, that something, anything, would eventually introduce some kind of technique that would allow for Japan to be stripped of cursed energy. But that something never came. The merger didn't happen. Sukuna died. Kenjaku was decapitated. And therefore the idea that Geto and kind of Yuki had to try and strip Japan of all of its cursed energy never actually came to fruition. I mean, after all, we dedicated a fair section of JJK to Geto talking about how we wanted to kill all non-sorcerers in order to make Japan a country where no cursed energy is emitted. However, obviously Geto wasn't able to accomplish this task as he was killed by Gojo. And Kenjaku wasn't able to initiate the merger to evolve cursed energy. And therefore this system that used sorcerers as expendable resources, well, it still existed at the end of JJK. And therefore, this cycle would simply continue. Kids would awaken as sorcerers when they were young, they would go to Jujutsu High, they would fight in anonymity against cursed spirits, eventually die with no one knowing their names, and then the next generation would step up. However, basically the entire point of Modulo was to show that that's no longer the case. See, not only Modulo are we told that cursed spirits only manifest in Tokyo now, and therefore cursed spirits have become a substantially smaller problem than they were 69 years ago, but also the ending of Modulo not only eradicates cursed spirits, but also cursed energy for all future generations. See, using the combination of the cursed energy of Rika, the idol transfiguration of Mahito, the entropic control and access to the passageway of souls of Maru, and the understanding of the separation between the body and the soul of Yuki, Chozo, and Yuji, the combined forces of Maru and Yuji were able to not only eliminate all cursed spirits inside of Tokyo, but also change the biological composition of all Japanese people that were to be born, such that they would no longer produce cursed energy, or that they would only produce as much cursed energy as those who live overseas. And thus, while cursed spirits would still be born in Japan, the amount of cursed spirits that we born on a yearly basis could fit in one hand. And thus, Yuji would work with Nobara and Todo to eliminate cursed spirits the second that they were born, in order to ensure that they don't gain any additional strength. On top of that, Nobara and Yuji come up with a plan to aggressively hunt down those who have access to heavenly restriction and map out their bloodlines in order to keep an eye on them should they ever produce more heavenly restriction users. They will then arm these heavenly restricted soldiers with cursed tools that they'll gather from the three great families, so they'll be able to exercise these cursed spirits, because cursed spirits need to be exercised with cursed energy, and just in case a true emergency does pop up, in 300 or so years when Yuji dies, he'll be turned into a cursed object, to be consumed if his cursed energy is ever needed again. So to those who were concerned that JJK left off not fixing the system that made JJK a story in the first place, well, Modulo took care of that for you. Now, to all of you who are wondering what happened to Kenjaku and if Kenjaku was brought back to life by Takaba, yeah, still no answer there. But I'm also not entirely sure that Gege didn't include that in the last couple of chapters of JJK to piss me specifically off. And with that, that's pretty much all of the plot lines that were left unresolved at the end of JJK that were either addressed or not addressed by Modulo. So as you can see, Modulo, outside of being a continuation of JJK's story, was also meant to clean up a lot of the loose ends that were left at the end of JJK. And I think it did that job beautifully. But what do you guys think? Do you think Modulo did a good job finishing off JJK's story, or was it lacking in your opinion? Let me know in the comments below. And while I get you down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, it's time to go do arms.